just sit down now?
What did you say?
You stay here on your chair?
No.
Just for the camera, just to know where.
No, I don't intend to be sitting down.
Hello. How are you? I leave that, and if you move, it doesn't matter. Okay.
Okay. You were going to sit or you were going to stand?
Or we stand.
Okay. I've just asked someone to get the last one. You can wait a couple of minutes.
Okay, well, I don't know until the end, so I don't necessarily have to wait, but it's better to wait.
I mean, it's very unusual to start on time.
Okay, so you tell me when. Meanwhile,
The issues concerning things like concerning finances, we'll talk about that after the speech.
Sure, yeah.
Okay. So then,
you need to leave? You need anything?
No, there was some stuff he left in my car which I didn't realise was apparently incredibly important. So it's still in my car. I'll ask someone to get it. Good afternoon. I think this has to be the best attended computing colloquium that I've ever organised. We'll still wait a couple of minutes. We never normally start on time anyway, just to let a few more people drift in, but just to let you know what's happening. So 2 more minutes maybe. You can carry on talking, it's okay. questions. Okay, good afternoon once again. I think we're ready to get started now. So this man needs no introduction. He's famous in the community of the free software world, and he's here to speak to us today all about the GNU Linux project and many other things. He will talk for about 1 hour and a half, and then we'll have time for questions. So with that, I hand over to Richard Stallman, who's just finishing an email.
It's always difficult for me to pull myself away from my work because I have so much of it. My work is mainly answering email. When I started the GNU project, my work was mainly programming, but in the last decade or so, I've been involuntarily self-promoted into management. So I don't really have time to program anymore. And that's sort of appropriate because although the main work of the GNU project has been technical software development, the goal is not technical and the issue at stake is not technical. The issue at stake here is a political, ethical, and social issue. Since I'm going to be standing in front of a TV camera, I might as well tuck my shirt in. It's not the easiest thing in the world anymore. Ah, there it's done. The issue at stake here, the issue of free software, is not a technical issue. It's an ethical, social, and political issue. The issue is, what should the rules of society be for using software? Most of the time, when people raise that issue, they address it, there are people who work for software companies, and they address it in a self-serving way. They really ask, what rules can we impose on everyone else to make them pay us a lot of money? I'm sure you've heard the answers that they come up with. I had the good fortune in the 1970s to be part of a community of programmers who shared software. And this led me to look at the same general question from a different direction, to ask, what kinds of rules make for a good society for the people living in it? And so I reached completely different answers. Let me say a little bit about this community. It included programmers at some of the best universities, and sometimes even programmers at computer companies participated. In our community, if you wrote a program, you shared it. That was our way of life. It was normal and expected. And if anybody ever didn't share a program, that was shocking. The lab where I worked, was the artificial intelligence lab at MIT, was in a way the deepest part of the community, because there, all the software we used was the community's software. We had an entire operating system, the Incompatible Time-Sharing System, or ITS, which was entirely developed by people in our community, and we shared it with anybody who found any interest in it. We were delighted when somebody did. We called ourselves hackers, which meant people who program and sometimes do other things in a spirit of playful cleverness. Giving 15 years of work a name that's a joke is an example of the hacker spirit. The Incompatible Time-Sharing System was serious work. We developed it because we wanted a time-sharing system. And then we kept on improving it and adding features to it. But that didn't stop us from having a name that's a joke, which just adds to what we had done. In this community, if you walked past another hacker's screen and saw an interesting thing on the screen, you'd say, hey, what is that? And he would tell you, oh, that's the new foobar program that we just got from Stanford, and it's in the foobar directory. At that point, in the foobar directory, you would find the executable that you could run, and also the source code, which you could study to see how they solved those problems. If you actually used the program, you'd probably encounter bugs, and you might have ideas for improvements. So you could go to the source code and fix the bugs, add new features, change it in whatever ways your imagination could suggest to you. You could even cut a piece of it out to put into some other program you were writing. We called that cannibalizing the old program, which was another joke, because unlike cannibalizing a machine for spare parts, in this case what you're doing is copying, so you don't destroy the existing program at all. It continues running, but you have a copy of some of that code in another program as well. So you could use the foobar program not just by running the executable, but in all the various ways that it might perhaps be useful. The software we developed in our community was part of human knowledge available to humanity for humanity to use. And the work we were doing was contributing to human knowledge, which enabled me to feel proud I was doing it. We were not merely trying to help one group of people outdo some other group of people, about which I have to ask myself, why bother? What's particularly desirable about that? I liked this way of life, and then we got a taste of what life was like for most computer users, the ones who were not part of a community like this one. That happened when Xerox gave MIT a laser printer. This was a handsome gift. It was the first time anyone outside Xerox had a laser printer. It was very fast. It printed a page a second. It had high resolution, and straight lines came out perfectly straight. So in some ways it was a very good printer, but it frequently got paper jams. And since nobody's office was very near the printer, it could stay jammed for a long time. This was a persistent problem, and as soon as we recognized it was a problem, we had an idea for how to deal with it. Namely, the same way we had used for our old printer. The old printer was slow and low resolution and also got paper jams. And since we were programmers, not printer engineers, we couldn't fix the printer not to get paper jams. So instead, we added features, nor could we fix it to run faster. So we added features to the software to compensate for the shortcomings of the printer itself. For instance, every time the printer finished a print job, the system displayed a message on the screen of the user who printed it, saying, "Your file foo has been printed." This was useful. You still had to wait because the printer was slow, but you didn't have to wait extra just because you could only guess when it was time to go to the printer. And there was another feature that I recall adding myself, that every time the printer got in trouble, say for instance got a paper jam, the system would display a message just for the users waiting for printing, saying, "The printer has a paper jam, go fix it." If you got that message, you would not bet on somebody else's fixing it. No, you would go immediately to the printer because you knew that only a few people were going to get that message. You couldn't take for granted anybody else would fix it. So you'd go to the printer immediately. The printer still got paper jams, but now, a minute later, 2 or 3 people would show up and fix the jam. In effect, we treated the user as part of the system, and we added end-to-end feedback, and we got reliable operation for the entire system, despite the unreliability of the printer component. Well, that was well and good. So of course, when we saw that the new printer tended to get paper jams, we thought of using the same solution. But there we ran into a stone wall. You see, we were able to add the feature for the old printer because the old printer was controlled by the community's software. We had the source code. We could therefore make changes, any changes we wanted to, limited only by our skill as programmers. But the new printer was controlled by proprietary Xerox software, and we did not have the source code. So in effect, we were prisoners of our software. We couldn't make any changes. Even the simplest changes were impossible. And the result was constant frustration. You'd type the command to print a file and go back to work because you know it's not worth going to the printer soon. A while later, you'd notice the time. Oh, maybe it's been half an hour. Not worth going to the printer yet. You go back to work. A while later, you notice the time. Oh, it's been an hour. Maybe it's printed now. So you walk upstairs to the printer and you see it's been jammed the whole time. So you fix the jam and you go back downstairs to work, and a while later you notice, oh, another half hour's gone. Maybe it's printed now. So you walk upstairs to the printer and you see it printed 200 pages of other people's stuff, which was just 3.5 minutes for this fast printer, and then jammed again. And at that point you say, I'm going to stand here and fix this every time it jams until I get my output. Constant frustration, the consequence of being prisoners of our software. And what made it even more galling was to realize that we could have solved the problem, except somebody in Xerox was deliberately standing in our way by denying us the source code for this program. Then I heard that somebody at Carnegie Mellon had a copy of the source code. Eventually, I was in Pittsburgh, so I went to his office and said, "Hi, I'm from MIT. Could I have a copy of the printer software source code?" And he said, "No, I promised not to give you a copy." I was not only angry, I was stunned. I couldn't think of an adequate way to express my anger. All I could think of at the moment was to walk out of his office and not say another word. So I kept on thinking about it afterwards, many times. Of course, the printer reminded me frequently. His refusal to cooperate with us, his colleagues at MIT, was very bad for us because we were never able to solve that problem, and the printer remained a pain to use for all the years we kept using it. But in an indirect way, it was very good for me because it taught me an important lesson. Important because most programmers didn't learn it. You see, he had promised to refuse to help us, his colleagues at MIT, but not just us. I think he did the same thing to you, chances are. And most likely, he did it to you as well. And I'd expect he did it to you too. In fact, he did it probably to almost everyone here in this room. The exceptions being anyone who wasn't born yet, because that was around 1980. Maybe some of you were not born yet. Because he had promised to deny his help, to deny his cooperation to just about the entire population of planet Earth. He had signed a non-disclosure agreement. This was my first direct encounter with a non-disclosure agreement. I was the victim. I and my whole lab were the victims. And the lesson it taught me was that non-disclosure agreements have victims. They are not innocent. They are not harmless. You're actually hurting someone, but you don't know who. A non-disclosure agreement is like a blank check of betrayal. I promise I will not cooperate with blank, and the blank gets filled in later according to circumstances, perhaps with the name of a stranger, perhaps with the name of your brother. You don't know who you're betraying, but you ought to know that you're betraying people. Most programmers first encounter a non-disclosure agreement when they're invited to sign one. And there's always some kind of temptation that you're going to get if you sign. So they make up excuses to close their eyes to the wrong of what they're doing, to ignore the ethical issue. They say to themselves, he'll never get a copy anyway, so why shouldn't I join the conspiracy to deny him? They say, this is the way it's normally done. Who am I to go against it? They say, if I don't sign this, somebody else will. Various excuses to gag their consciences. But when somebody invited me to sign a non-disclosure agreement, my conscience was already sensitized. I remembered how angry I had been when somebody else did this to me and my whole lab. And I could not, my conscience wouldn't let me do the same thing to other people who hadn't done me any wrong, who hadn't done anything to deserve it. You know, if someone asked me to promise not to share a copy with that guy at Carnegie Mellon who'd refused to help me, I would have said yes. But to do that to you hadn't done me any wrong. I couldn't justify doing wrong to you. So I said, thank you so much for offering me this nice computer program, but I cannot, in good conscience, accept the conditions you have set, so I will do without it. No thanks. And I have never knowingly signed a non-disclosure agreement for generally useful technical information such as software. There are other kinds of information which raise different ethical issues. For instance, there's personal information. Now, that's a totally different issue here because personal information normally is not available to the public in any way, whereas software products are available to the public somehow. So, for instance, if you asked if you could talk with me about what was going on between you and your sweetheart, and would I please not tell anybody, that I could agree to, because that's not generally useful technical information. At least it probably isn't. Now, I could imagine it's conceivable that you might disclose to me a wonderful new sex technique, and I would then feel a moral duty to pass that on to other people who might have a chance to use it someday. But when it's a matter, when we're talking about the knowledge of science and technology, the mission of these fields is to develop generally useful technical information for humanity to use. If we withhold it instead, we are betraying the mission of our fields. After some years of thought, I reached the conclusion that that was wrong, that no one should ever do it, and that I should never do it in particular. But during that same time, a series of calamities fell on my community and ultimately wiped it out. The last blow, I think, was when Digital discontinued making the PDP-10 computer. The incompatible time-sharing system was written in assembler language for the PDP-10. So when the PDP-10 was discontinued, in effect, 15 years of our work turned into dust and blew away. Now that's a heavy blow for anyone, but the consequences were much worse, because the only operating systems for modern computers were all proprietary. which meant that to buy a computer and use it, you had to start by signing a non-disclosure agreement. To start using a computer, your first act had to be to betray all your fellows. This, I believe, is called moral bad luck. Except in this case, it wasn't just bad luck, it was a certainty, not luck. So the consequence of this for me was a moral dilemma, because I could not continue working in my field, operating system development, as I had been doing it before. That required having a community of people to cooperate with and share with, and a free operating system to use and extend. Both of them were gone. So what was I going to do? The most obvious option was to accept that the world had changed and adapt myself to it, to be the reasonable man. This would have meant signing non-disclosure agreements and using non-free software, and most likely MIT would have had me developing non-free software as well. I realized that this way I could make money and have fun programming, but at the end I would look back and say, I've spent my career building walls to divide people, and I'd be ashamed of everything I had done. So I looked for another option, and it wasn't hard to find another option. I could leave the computer field and do something else. It was easy for me to think of this, but many programmers apparently can't think it at all. They say, if I don't do this and this to get a job programming, I'll starve. That's literally what they say. Don't they realize that even in the US, even in Switzerland, there are millions of people who don't work in the software field and don't starve? Now, I had no other special noteworthy skills, but surely I could have been a waiter. Well, maybe I wouldn't make the grade in Switzerland, but in the US, I could be a waiter somewhere. Now, there are two important points about being a waiter. One is, as a waiter, you're not doing anything unethical, unless perhaps it's in McDonald's. And the other is, as a waiter, you're not going to starve, unless perhaps it's in McDonald's. I should point out that the popularity and success of McDonald's is due to a misunderstanding of Americans who were perhaps not well enough educated. They heard the term fast food and they thought it meant rapid food, but it actually means food for not eating, because fast means not eat. So this food was never meant to be eaten. The purpose is, if you are fasting, but you are feeling hungry and you're tempted to eat, you imagine that McDonald's food and lose your appetite, and then you can complete your fast. But of course, those Americans misunderstood it, and now you find McDonald's all around the world. But now you know what to say if any friend of yours ever proposes actually eating in one. In any case, I had found an ethically legitimate way to deal with my situation, to avoid doing anything wrong. However, I realized that being a waiter for me would be no fun at all, and it would be wasting my skills as an operating system developer. It's better to waste your skills than misuse them. Developing non-free software is misuse of your skill. But although it was better, it was not really good. So I looked for another option to see if I could find a better one. I asked myself whether there was anything constructive that an operating system developer could do in the situation, something that would actually make the world better. And I realized that that's exactly what was needed to solve the problem: operating system development. You see, the moral dilemma existed for me and for every computer user because all the operating systems for modern computers were proprietary. By developing another operating system and making it free software, I could give me and every computer user a way out of the dilemma. And I realized that this was probably the most important thing that I'd ever have a chance to try to do in my entire life. And I concluded I was elected by circumstances to do this job. It's as if you see somebody drowning and you know how to swim and it's not Bush. Then you have a duty to rescue him. Now, I don't know how to swim, but I do know how to write software, and in this case, what was needed was writing software. I was aware of the problem. No one else was paying attention. I had the skills necessary to try to solve the problem, and nobody else was likely to try if I did not. So I decided I would develop a free software operating system or die trying, presumably of old age. Because at the time, free software had no enemies. We just had a very large amount of work to do, so large that many people thought it was hopeless to get started. But I decided that I was going to start, and maybe I would get it done. This decision led to many other decisions, technical design decisions. If you are carrying a tracking device, please turn it off. You really shouldn't use those portable phones because they keep track of where you go all the time, not just when you're talking on them, you know. So it's an ideal surveillance tool for Big Brother. You know, they forget about worrying whether Big Brother is going to start implanting chips in people. No, it's just easy to get the people to voluntarily carry them around all the time. If you don't fight for your freedom, you will lose it. So, that decision led to other decisions, technical design decisions. What kind of system should it be? I had just seen one free operating system turn into dust and blow away because it was written for a specific computer architecture which became obsolete. I didn't want to write another system over a period of years only to see it become obsolete as well. Clearly, this system had to be portable. But there was just one successful portable operating system that I had heard of, and that was Unix. So I decided to follow the design of Unix. That way there'd be a reasonable chance I could make a system that really was portable also. Furthermore, I knew that users don't like incompatible changes. I could have taken all my favorite ideas from the various systems I'd worked on, plus my own pet ideas, and made my dream operating system, but it would have been incompatible with everything, and I knew what the users would say. They'd say, this is very nice, but we have trained our users to use Unix, and we've written our programs for Unix, and it would be too much work to switch over, so no thanks. At that point, I would have had a ready-made excuse. I could have said, I offered them liberty and they didn't take it, so now it's their fault. But I wanted to make more than just an excuse. I wanted to build a community that would really have people living in freedom in it. To do this, I had to write an operating system that people would actually use. So I decided to make it upward compatible with Unix. I could add more features, whatever I could think of that people might like, but the Unix ways of doing things had to work. This had interesting consequences, this decision, because Unix consists of many components that work together, communicating through interfaces that were more or less documented and that users took advantage of. So to be upward compatible with Unix, you had to replace each component compatibly using the same interfaces. And that meant that all the initial design decisions were made. That was a relief. So the only thing I needed in order to start work was a name. Now, we hackers like to find an amusing or even a mischievous name for our programs, because thinking of the users being amused by the name is half the fun of writing the program. And solving the technical problems is the other half. We also had a tradition that when you were writing a program that resembled some existing program, which was a common thing to have to do in the days before programs were portable, you could give your program a name that was a recursive acronym saying, this program is not the other one. For instance, in the 60s and 70s, there were many similar text editors called Tico. Not exactly compatible, but similar. And most of them were called something or other Tico, but one clever hacker called his program Tint, for Tint is not Tico, the first recursive acronym. We loved that. Then in 1975, I developed the first Emacs text editor, the extensible programmable text editor. And there were many imitations of Emacs, and some were called something or other Emacs. But one was called Fine for Fine is not Emacs. And there was Sign for Sign is not Emacs. And Ina for Ina is not Emacs. And Mince for Mince is not complete Emacs. And then Ina was mostly rewritten, and version 2 was called Zwei, for Zwei was Ina initially. So I looked for a recursive acronym. Oh, and we also today have some more recursive acronyms. For instance, WINE stands for Wine is not an emulator. So I looked for a recursive acronym for something is not Unix. I tried the obvious 4-letter approach and discovered that none of those possibilities made a word in English. And if it doesn't have some other meaning, it's not funny. So I looked for another way to do it. I was racking my brains, nothing came to mind, so I thought maybe I'll make a contraction. Then I could get a 3-letter recursive acronym. But nothing immediately jumped to mind, so I started substituting letters. Anu, Bnu, Knu, Dnu, Inu, Fnu, Gnu. Well, GNU is the funniest word in the English language. If you can call something GNU, you can't resist. Why is the word GNU so funny? It's because according to the dictionary, it's pronounced new. So somebody started asking, hey, what's GNU? And then various other wordplay got started. There's even a funny song based on the word GNU. I think it was from before I was born. So with so much tradition of humor about the word GNU, I couldn't resist it. But I should point out that when it's the name of our operating system, you should not follow the dictionary. If you talk about the new operating system, you'll get people very confused. We've been working on it for about 20 years now, so it's not new anymore. But it still is and always will be GNU, no matter how many people call it Linux by mistake. So I had a name I could start. In January, first I announced it on the net to ask people if they wanted to help. But I think I only found one person who really started working on anything. And then in January 1984, I quit my job at MIT to start writing GNU. I had to quit my job because as an MIT employee, there was a danger that the MIT administration could claim that my software was MIT property and turn it into proprietary software products. It would be better not to write it at all than let it become non-free. And I didn't want to take the risk, and I didn't want to have to beg the MIT administration to go along. So by quitting my job, I took them out of the equation. But the head of the AI lab at the time was nice enough to let me keep using the facilities. So I began using a Unix machine at MIT to start writing pieces of the GNU system, which we also call GNU programs. At the time, I thought that we would write all of these programs and get an entire running system, and then we would have users. But that's not how it happened. In September 1984, I started developing GNU Emacs, which was my second implementation of the extensible text editor. And in early '85, it was working well enough that I could do all my editing with it. And that was quite convenient. You see, I had no intention of learning to use VI. And so, until that time, I did my editing on other machines where there was an Emacs and copied the files through the net to test them. But once GNU Emacs was running, I could do my editing on the Unix machine itself. When GNU Emacs was running well enough for my editing, it was running well enough for other people's editing too. And people started asking me for copies, which meant I had to decide on the precise details of how to distribute these pieces of GNU. Of course, I put a copy in the FTP server directory, and that was good for people on the internet. But in 1985, most programmers were not on the internet. So I was getting requests from them asking if there was a way I could send it to them on a mag tape. What was I going to say? I could have said, I want to spend my time writing more pieces of GNU, not writing mag tapes. So find a friend who's on the internet who will download it for you. And they would have found somebody sooner or later. But I had no job. And in fact, I've never had a job since January 1984. And I was looking for some way I could make a living through my work on free software. So I made an announcement, send me $150 and I'll mail you a tape of Emacs. And the orders began trickling in, well, dribbling in, I'd say. And by the middle of the year, they were trickling in. I was getting 8 to 10 orders a month, which, if necessary, I could have lived on, because I've always lived basically like a student. And this is deliberate. I don't want to get trapped by expensive habits. Now, most Americans, if they start making this much money, they look for a way to spend this much. So they start buying houses and cars and boats and planes and rare stamps and artwork and adventure travel and children. All sorts of expensive luxuries that weigh heavily on the world, especially the children. And then, in order to get the money to pay for this, they have to spend all their time at the dictates of whoever has money. And they don't even have any time to play with all these toys, which is especially sad in connection with the children. And Europe is going that way too. You know, basically, given the unfair competition of the US and a lot of the rest of the world, the pressure is on Europe to lower everybody's standard of living to match the US and make life just as hard here as it is there. And the solution proposed is always to let business mistreat workers more in Europe, never to make business treat workers better in the rest of the world. Because where are the solutions coming from? They're coming from politicians who work for business or from business itself. In any case, I recommend that you reject these expensive habits too, because that way you will be free to choose to do what you want with your life. You'll be able to do what's important to you, instead of what somebody with a lot of money thinks is important to him. So, I was selling copies of GNU Emacs for $150 each. And this led some people to ask, what do you mean it's free software if it costs $150? They were led astray because the English word free has multiple meanings. One meaning refers to price, and another meaning refers to freedom. When we talk of free software, we're referring to freedom, not price. So think of free speech, not free beer. It's clearer if you're speaking French because you can say logiciel libre, and then it's clear that you're not referring to price. It's not the same thing as logiciel gratuit. Anyone who translates free software as gratuit is making a mistake, and please correct it. Some people got their copies of GNU Emacs from me through the net at no charge. For them, it was gratis. Others got their copies from me on a tape and paid me. For them, it was not gratis. Others got their copies not from me, but from somebody else who already had a copy. And for that, well, maybe they paid the somebody else, I don't know, because it was between them, but they didn't pay me. So, for some users, GNU Emacs was gratis. For some users, it was paid for. But it was free software for all of them, because all of them had certain essential freedoms, which are the definition of free software. So now I've come to the center of the talk, the definition of free software. Because it's easy to say, I'm in favor of freedom. But the real issue is, which are the freedoms that are important? Because possible freedoms conflict with other possible freedoms. And the hard decision is to choose which are the freedoms that are so important that we should defend them and make sure everybody has them, and what has to give way to those. The definition of free software is formulated in terms of your freedom. A program is free software for you, a particular user, if you have the following freedoms, all of them. Freedom 0 is the freedom to run the program for any purpose. Freedom 1 is the freedom to help yourself by studying the source code to learn what it does and then changing it to suit your needs. Freedom 2 is the freedom to help your neighbor by distributing copies to others. And freedom 3 is the freedom to help build your community by publishing an improved version so others can benefit from your contribution. All these freedoms are essential. These are not levels of freedom. These are all parts of the necessary freedom. If any of it is missing, then the program does not respect the user's freedom, and we have to say no to it. Freedom 0 is pretty obvious. If you're restricted even in running the program, that's rather restrictive software. But the other freedoms require somewhat more explanation, and I'll now give it. Freedom 2 is necessary for basic ethical reasons. The most important resource of any society is the spirit of goodwill, the willingness to help your neighbor, to help other people. Now, nobody does everything that anybody ever asks for. You have to take care of yourself also. But if people don't help each other, then instead of a society, what you have is a dog-eat-dog jungle. A society is livable based on the amount of this spirit of goodwill that we have, because social attitudes can influence it to some extent. Other people normally help you, you'll probably help other people more often. This is why societies have made great efforts in the past to encourage people to help each other. This is, I think, why the world's major religions for thousands of years have explicitly promoted the spirit of goodwill towards other people. So what does it mean when powerful social institutions say that it's wrong to share? They're poisoning this resource, something that no society can afford. What does it mean when they say that if you share with your neighbor, you're a pirate? They're saying that helping your neighbor is the moral equivalent of attacking a ship, which is morality backwards, because attacking a ship is very, very wrong, and helping your neighbor is laudable. And what does it mean when they establish harsh punishments for anyone caught sharing? How much fear is it going to take before people are too scared to help each other? Do you want your society to be permeated by this level of fear? If you don't, then you better reject and oppose the anti-sharing policies before they ratchet up the fear to the point that they're starting to consider. In the US, there's been a proposal that sharing even one copy of a song on the internet should be a felony, meaning imprisonment for years. In the UK, they've proposed 10-year punishments for sharing even non-commercially for no gain. How much fear is it going to take before people are too scared to help each other? That is the reason for freedom too, and the principle I've adopted is if I have to promise not to share something with you, I won't accept it. Freedom 1 is necessary for a different reason, so that you won't be a prisoner of your software. Freedom 1 means that you can study the source code and see what the program really does. And if you don't like it, you can change it. So you are in control of your own computer. If the software doesn't give you this freedom, then the program's owner controls your computer. You don't. So, what do they do when they control your computer? Well, it's not unusual to put in malicious features deliberately. Many of these features are spy features. It's called spyware. For instance, several years ago, people discovered that Windows had a feature that it would send back to Microsoft a listing of your disk. And there was a scandal about this, and Microsoft took it out. I guess at that point, Microsoft felt a little bit of a need to listen to public opinion, but not for long, because earlier this year, someone figured out that they had put it back secretly. Windows XP, when it asks for an upgrade, sends the list of what's on your disk to Microsoft. But it sends it encrypted so that it wasn't easy to tell that this was actually going on. But Windows is not the only program that spies on you. Windows Media Player spies also. It sends Microsoft a list of what you listen to. And Microsoft is not the only company that does this. Real Player does the same thing. The TiVo does the same thing. They spy on you. And the idea is that you can't get rid of that. Now, spying is not the only malicious feature that non-free programs have. For instance, some of them implement what's called DRM, Digital Restrictions Management, where it's designed to stop you from using the data in certain ways. And the Kazaa music sharing program has an interesting malicious feature. They actually sell time on your computer as part of a distributed computing scheme. They didn't tell the users about this. It was discovered by someone, I don't know how, maybe by watching network traffic. And when they were confronted with it, they said, well, look at the license. The license says we can do essentially anything at all. So the users already gave permission for this without knowing what it was. There are other possible malicious features. For instance, I think there's a Microsoft program, I think it's an email program, which has, somebody looked at the symbols in it, and there's a symbol called NSA key and another called NSA key 1. And people speculate that this is some kind of backdoor for the National Security Agency in the US to use to get access to your system. But of course we don't know. We don't know what really goes on there. And we can't tell. Oh, and Microsoft has a rather absurd program nowadays of letting governments look at source code for Microsoft software, supposedly so that they can assure themselves that the software is not spying on them or opening up a back door. But the joke is that the governments can't have copies of the source code themselves. All they can do is connect to a special Microsoft server where they can run debugging sessions looking at the source code. Of course, there's no way they can determine whether the source code that they are looking at corresponds to what's running in their computers. So the whole thing is a scam. Not all developers of non-free software put in malicious features, but they're all human, and they all make mistakes. All programmers make mistakes. We call them bugs. And with Freedom 1, you can debug and correct these bugs. Without Freedom 1, you're just stuck. And that's why the support, and the only ones who can fix it are the owners of the program. In effect, support for a non-free program is a monopoly, which is why the support is usually so bad. Some companies will say, pay us and we'll let you report a bug. And if you do this, they will say, thank you so much. In 6 months there will be an upgrade. Buy the upgrade and you'll see if this bug was fixed. And you'll see what new bugs we have for you. Even if there is a choice of non-free programs to do the job, for each of them, support is a monopoly. So it's a paradox, not a contradiction, just a paradox, that you are choosing between monopolies. In effect, it's a choice of masters, but being able to choose your master is not freedom. With Freedom 1, you, if you're a programmer, can study what the program does and then make it do what you want. But this freedom is not enough. For one thing, there are millions of people who don't program. And Freedom 1 by itself, the freedom to personally study and change the code, wouldn't do them any good. But even for programmers, it's not enough, because one programmer doesn't have time to study the source code of all the programs there are and change them. So we need more, and what we need is Freedom 3. which enables us to collectively take control of our software. With Freedom 3, some people can make changes and then publish the changed version, and others can get the benefit of it. If there are 1 million people who want certain changes, most likely 10,000 of them will know how to program. So it's likely that there will be 10 of those programmers who will decide to make the change. And then they can publish the changed version, and all 1 million can get the benefit of it. So this is how non-programmers can get the features they want. But there's another way as well. A group of non-programmers can pool their funds and pay programmers to make the change they want to their specifications. They can go to a free software support company and say, how much will you charge to do this job, and when could it be ready? And if they don't like the answer, they can go to another support company and ask the same question, because support for free software is a free market. Anybody can offer the support. And there are actually a lot of small companies around the world providing this kind of service, which suggests that for those who value support, you'll be able to get better support for your money if you're using free software. I think that's a rather secondary issue, but there are those to whom it is important. With Freedom 3, free software becomes like science in that it's a field where people contribute building on the work that others have done before them, contributing their knowledge to humanity for everyone to use. And the spirit of scientific cooperation was one of the ideas that I learned when I was young that helped to inspire the free software movement. So these are the freedoms that are essential, that define free software. These are the freedoms that are necessary for users individually and collectively to be able to use the software as part of a decent society where they are free and independent. Non-free software keeps users divided and helpless. The licensing scheme is designed specifically to keep users divided and helpless, and that's what makes it unethical. So make no mistake, I am saying that non-free software is unethical. It's a social problem, and it should not exist. And the goal, the ultimate goal that I'm working for is to bring an end to the anti-social system of non-free software and replace it with the social system of free software, a system where we encourage people to help each other, but do not compel any particular person to do any particular thing. The work of the GNU project during the 80s was to develop all these many components that we needed in order to have a complete GNU system. Once in a while, somebody else wrote a program and made it free for whatever reason. And when that happened, we used it. The job that we had to do was so big that people said that we could never do it. Well, I thought maybe we could do it, but I had to agree it was a big job. We couldn't afford not invented here. We couldn't afford to redo something that was available and was free. Consider, for instance, the X window system. It was developed at MIT in the 80s and released under a free software license, a license that gave the user all these essential freedoms. So we could use it. I had been planning all along to have a window system in GNU, but we never developed a GNU window system because before we got around to doing that, I saw X. I saw X was powerful and becoming popular, and it was free. So I decided to save work by using X instead. So I put X into the GNU system, and we started changing other GNU programs to work with X. And in general, we did that whenever it was possible, because our goal was not to have been the authors of all the code. Our goal was to bring a complete free operating system into existence so you could have freedom with it. It wasn't necessary that all the code be written by us. But in fact, it was only by good fortune that other people wrote parts of it. That only happened occasionally. So there were lots of pieces that we had to write or recruit somebody to write. And that was our work during the 80s. In October 1985, we started the Free Software Foundation. I figured that with the example of GNU Emacs and its popularity, people would see that GNU was not just vaporware, that we were capable of producing useful software, and that maybe they would start actually donating money. So it was worth starting a tax-exempt charity to make it easier for people to donate. And since then, some important pieces of the GNU system have been developed by the staff of the Free Software Foundation. For instance, the GNU-C library, which every user space program pretty much needs to link with, was written by an FSF staff person, and its manual was written by another staff person. And the shell or command interpreter, our shell is called the Born Again shell, because the original Unix shell was called the Born shell. Another humorous hacker name. That was also developed by an FSF staff person. But the bulk of the work was done by volunteers, and we've had thousands of volunteers. Some are full-time volunteers. For instance, I am. I work full-time, but the FSF doesn't pay me. When the FSF first had enough money to hire someone, I, as president, had to decide who it should be. And I could have decided to hire Stallman, but I realized that that would be like throwing the money away because we could get Stallman to work for nothing. So to spend the money effectively, I hired someone else. And that principle continues to this day. In addition, once I started getting invited to travel a lot, I realized that if the FSF paid for my travel, I could hardly claim I was not getting remuneration. So the FSF cannot pay for my travel. So I have to get it financed some other way. However, there are other full-time volunteers. Most of them are getting paid by somebody else, though, just not by us. So for us, they're volunteers. They may be working for universities or companies or whatever. There are also many thousands of part-time volunteers who are really not getting paid by anyone. And sometimes people find this hard to believe because they have a simplistic theory about human nature where they think that people never do anything for any reason except pay. Of course, if you look around in your life, you'll see that that's not true, that human nature is complex, and there are many motivations, many possible feelings. A person can even have multiple motivations for a single act. So what are some of the motivations for writing free software? I'll tell you some of the ones I know of. One of them is political idealism, making the world a better place where people are free. That's an important part of my motivation, but it's not the whole. It's not the only one. And many other free software developers share that at least partly, but not all of them do. Another motivation is fun. Programming is tremendous fun. Not for everybody, of course, but for a lot of the best programmers, and those are the ones whose help we want the most. It's especially fun if nobody's telling you what to do, which is why there are many people who are employed as programmers and like to write free software in their spare time. Also, another motivation is to be appreciated. If 1% of our community uses your program, That's hundreds of thousands of people. So you're going to get a lot of appreciation. Another is professional reputation. Similar but not the same. If 1% of our community uses your program, that gives you a professional reputation right there. You don't even have to go to school. Another motivation is gratitude. If you've been using our community's software for years and appreciating how good it is and the freedom that comes with it, then when you write a program, that gives you an opportunity to give something back. Another motivation, a bit shallow I would say, is hatred for Microsoft. It's shallow because it focuses the criticism on one of many developers of non-free software. Microsoft has subjugated more users than any other software developer. But this is not because the others didn't try. It's just that they didn't succeed in subjugating as many people as Microsoft has. So they're not really any better. The problem with, when people write free software because they hate Microsoft, their contribution is useful. But the reason why it's a mistake is if you think that the only problem is Microsoft, you're likely to start excusing and even endorsing other non-free software developers. It's not unusual in our community for people to be grateful when non-free software developers release versions of their non-free programs that run on the GNU system. There are people who think that this is a contribution to our community, not recognizing that this is just as bad as Windows. It may be a trap with fewer people in it, but it's just as bad a trap. It's the same kind of problem. And we need to replace it with free software, not praise it. So we need to remind other people that Microsoft is just one of the companies developing software that's an ethical problem. Not the problem is bigger than Microsoft. Another motive sometimes for some people is to make better software. There are people who argue that free software is also a way of getting software that runs better and is more reliable. Okay, well, if they help our community for that reason, they're still helping. And another motive is pay. There are at least hundreds of people, maybe thousands, who are making a living one way or another from developing and supporting free software. And for them, pay is a motive. That's even included me some of the time. In October '85, when the FSF was founded, the FSF took over the distribution service of mailing tapes of GNU Emacs. And I didn't feel I should compete with the foundation being its president, so I stopped. I had to find another way to make a living, and what I did was I made improvements on commission. And when I was doing that, pay was a part of my motive. I would have been working on free software anyway, but I chose to work on the particular improvement someone wanted to pay for rather than something else. So the pay was part of my motive for doing the specific job I was doing. And there could be other motives I just don't know about. Whatever the motives are, a lot of people seem to share them. There are at least 500,000 developers of free software because there are that many on just one site, and that's not the whole community. So other people have estimated 1 million developers of free software today. So throughout the 80s, we were filling in these programs we needed to have a complete system. At some points, when it looked like the gaps were fewer than what we had, we made a list of what was missing, which was called the GNU task list. Initially, it was a list of pieces of Unix that we needed to replace. Nowadays, those programs are all done. It's now a list of application programs that we want. Because it's not enough just to have a free operating system. That had to be first, because you can't even run your computer without an operating system. But once you have an operating system, you may want other programs as well, and those should all be free also. No computer user should ever feel torn between getting some important job done and keeping his freedom. We should make it possible to do all the jobs and live in freedom. By 1991, the system was almost complete. There was one major component still missing, and that was the kernel. We started developing our kernel in 1990. I had been looking for some kind of shortcut, because in general, I was looking for existing programs that there was a way to use so as to reduce the amount of work we had to do. And so various hard parts I tried putting off until we could get a starting point to make it less work. After all, there were many essential components, and it doesn't really matter what order you do them in, since you have to do them all. So the kernel got put off because we were looking at possible starting points, and we found one, a microkernel called Mach, that had been developed as a government-funded project in Carnegie Mellon. It wasn't free software, but they were going to re-release it as free software. So we decided once they re-released it, we could use it. The idea was that we would start with Mach, and then we would develop the top half of the kernel on top of Mach as a collection of server programs that would communicate by message passing. This advanced architecture would make our kernel more powerful than the typical Unix kernel. And I thought also that because we could debug these things as user programs, and because half the job was already done, that we'd have less work to do and we'd get it done sooner. That turned out to be a mistake. It took many, many years to get the GNU kernel to run. Fortunately, we didn't have to wait that long, because in 1991, Linus Torvalds, a college student in Finland, developed his own kernel. He used the traditional monolithic approach where you just write one program that does the whole job. Initially, it was not free software, but in 1992, he re-released it under the GNU General Public License, which is our preferred free software license. There are many free software licenses. The GNU GPL is the one that the GNU project recommends most of the time. He used our license for his kernel, which was called Linux. At that point, it was possible to fit Linux into the gap in the GNU system and make a complete operating system. And this is what people did. We didn't know about Linux at the time. Linus Torvalds never contacted us to say, I have a kernel, do you want to use it? He never contacted us at all, but he announced it somewhere on the net. And people who knew about it then looked around to try to find the rest of the system. They looked around, and lo and behold, everything they needed was already there. What good fortune, they said. But it was no accident, because what they were finding were all the pieces of the GNU system. They already worked together because we intended them to work together. So, in fact, they were adding Linux to fill the gap in GNU, but they didn't realize that. They didn't realize they were making a GNU plus Linux operating system. They thought they were starting with Linux and adding all these other things on top of it. So they called the result a Linux system. And that's the origin of the error, which has led the tens of millions of users of this system mostly to have the wrong idea of who developed it and why. They think that the whole system is Linux, and that it was all started by Linus Torvalds in 1991. And they think it exists because of Linus Torvalds' frequently stated vision of the world, which is a purely engineering vision. The goals he cites are goals of engineering professionalism, but nothing beyond that. He doesn't want political issues interfering with technical decisions. The exact opposite of what society learned so painfully from the development of nuclear weapons. The idea that engineers should constantly think about the social implications of the work they're doing. He holds the opposite view. Technical decisions should be made technically. Well, he has a right to his views, and I apologize if I've misstated them. These are what I think they are, but I do not speak for him. He has a right to his views, but views like these would never have motivated the development work that the GNU project did. We had to develop a completely free operating system so that we could reject non-free software. There's a chain of purposes and means to achieve them, all starting from that ethical vision. And that's why we did the work we did. If you don't hold that goal, you won't do the same work. The views, apolitical views, such as Linus Torvalds's, can motivate people to develop individual programs, but would never have motivated the overall project that we did, because it doesn't logically suggest that project. There is no logical reason to do that, to do the project we did for motives like his. Today, there is actually a separate movement which comes out of such views. It's called the open source movement. People who talk about open source recommend practices similar to ours, but they only recommend it. They don't say, this is the only way that people can live in freedom while they use computers. They don't say that what they are doing is bringing people freedom. They just present practical benefits, developing more powerful and reliable software, for instance. And because of that, their recommendations are only recommendations. They don't say reject non-free programs. They don't say reject non-open source programs. They don't say that it's an issue of right versus wrong. They just say it's an issue of a better development model. They like to focus on collaborative development, saying that that's a way to produce better software. Well, if that's true, I'm glad, because it means that freedom has a practical benefit as a byproduct. That's not unusual, that people who enjoy freedom can arrange their lives better. However, if that's all you look at, you're missing the most important point. And that's where the free software movement, which I founded, differs from the other movement. In the free software movement, we raise this as an ethical, social, and political issue. If you want to live in freedom, make sure that you're the one who controls the software on your computer. Don't accept programs that divide the users and keep them helpless. The open source movement carefully avoids talking about that. So we have two groups whose conduct is similar enough that we can work together some of the time, but citing philosophies that are completely different, based on different kinds of values. The most important question in your life is what your values are, and that's where we and they disagree. Before Linux was added to the GNU system, there were people who used these pieces of GNU that we already had. They had to install them on some other operating system because we didn't have a complete system. And when they did that, they realized they were installing pieces of GNU. So they were fans of GNU, a lot of them. And when they saw our articles about the purpose of it all, they would pay serious attention. Not everybody agreed, of course, but at least it helped if they paid attention to what we said. And when they did agree, they would then feel motivated to extend and develop free software. So the software spread our philosophy, and the philosophy extended our software. When people began using essentially the entire GNU operating system, but calling it Linux, the connection from our software to our philosophy was broken. If they appreciated the software, they would think of themselves as Linux users, and they would look to the philosophy, the apolitical philosophy of Linus Torvalds, as their inspiration. And as a result, ever since then, it's been rather difficult for us to present our philosophy to the public on the strength of our work. And this is why I ask you, please do not call the system Linux. Linux is the name of one important component, but the system as a whole is GNU with Linux added. It's the GNU/Linux system, or GNU plus Linux if you prefer. Please give us equal mention. We deserve at least equal mention. We did start it, and we did the biggest part of the job. If you give us equal mention, it will help us in our work today, which consists to a large extent in presenting the philosophy of free software to the public, as I'm doing now. When people think of themselves as Linux users, they respond in rather ironic ways. They may see what we have to say and respond, well, what's that got to do with me? That's the GNU philosophy. I'm a Linux user. And what they mean is they're using a version of the GNU system, but they don't realize that. It's ironic. Or they may say, it may go even further, and they may say, this emphasis on freedom is a mistake because it interferes with the success of Linux. So here they're not just misunderstanding what Linux is, but they're misunderstanding what success is too. They think of success as mere popularity. They think that the whole purpose of what they don't know is the GNU system is just to be software that has many users. That's just a means to an end. Why should we care, really, about increasing the number of users of a particular kernel that Linus Torvalds wrote? The kernel is free software, and it does its job. It's a good kernel to use, and in fact, I use it. But the popularity of this kernel makes no sense as an end in itself. Or suppose that you think Linux is the entire GNU plus Linux system. Why should the popularity of this operating system be so important? It's a good operating system, it does its job, and I'm proud I launched its development, but even I realize that the popularity of this system is not so important. It's not worth making the end in itself. The end that we're working for is freedom to cooperate. Linux and the whole GNU/Linux system are important because they are a means to that end, because they make it possible to live in freedom in a community. But they don't guarantee that you'll live in freedom in a community. You can use the GNU/Linux system and install the Oracle database on it. And the Oracle database is just as non-free as Windows, so you're not living in freedom then. Using a free operating system is a necessary step to living in freedom, but it doesn't necessarily get you all the way there. It's vital for our community's future that we remember this, that we remember that there's a bigger goal than just adopting one big piece of free software. Many people talk about promoting the use of free software, and they don't realize that this language is ambiguous in a crucial way. Because what does it mean to have more use of free software? Does it just mean more people who use some free software? That's a legitimate meaning of the term, but that's too weak to be our goal. Our goal should be replacing the social system of non-free software with the social system of free software. This means use of exclusively free software. It's like a product which says made with real butter, and the question is, does that mean they used only real butter, or did they use 10% real butter and 90% margarine? They could say that they used real butter. They did. But that's not what we really have in mind. And if you look around in our community, you'll see lots of people making that very mistake, thinking that the goal is simply to have some free software being used by more people. Get more people to take a step. Well, it's good to take a step towards freedom. The point is, we have to remember that that first step is not the whole journey. And there are a lot of people in our community who forget that now, who forget the idea that the goal is freedom. And to reach a distant goal, the most important thing is to remember the goal. If you forget it, you won't get there. Especially when the goal is freedom, because there are always people offering you opportunities to trade away your freedom for some short-term advantage. And if you don't recognize the issue of freedom, if you don't value freedom, then you won't defend it, and then you'll probably lose it. This, of course, is not a new lesson from other areas of life, but it's one that people have a tendency continually to forget. And so we have to keep reminding other people. Defend your freedom or you will lose it. And nowadays, as computers are used for more and more aspects of society's activities, it may soon be that if we give up the freedoms of free software, we will be unable to defend other important freedoms that people have understood for much longer. What are the threats we face nowadays? When we started the GNU project, we had no enemies. Nobody was trying to stop us from developing the GNU system. It was just a matter of doing a lot of programming. Today, however, we have enemies. Large corporations and governments that are their flunkies, trying to stop us. The US government is their flunky. The US government works for corporations. We used to have government of the people, by the people, for the people, but now it's government of the people, for the corporations. I'm sad to say. Corporations make donations to the election campaigns of politicians, and this is not illegal, but it does effectively buy them. So for all intents and purposes, it's corruption. In the US today, there are two different kinds of laws that prohibit the development of various free software. Even though the jobs that these programs would do are not illegal jobs. If program for murdering people, I guess that should be illegal. Viruses, I think it's fine if viruses are illegal. But I'm talking about programs to do perfectly lawful jobs. Jobs that you can get non-free software to do in any store. One of these laws is the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, which prohibits independently written software under most conditions to access encrypted media. For instance, playing a DVD. The data on a DVD is encrypted in a format that was originally secret. Then a few programmers in Europe figured it out and wrote a free program to play the movie on a DVD. So you could buy a DVD and put it into your computer that's running exclusively free software and watch the film. But this program is prohibited in the US. It's censored. Because they say it could be used to bypass the restrictions that the authorized programs impose on the user. It could, for instance, be used for copying. You don't need this program to do, if you want to copy the DVD illegally, but it could be used for copying. Another thing it could be used for is to skip the commercials and not watch them. And this is illegal in the US. And I'm sad to say, I think it's illegal in Europe now also, because a couple of years ago, Europe adopted a copyright directive, the European Union, that is, adopted a copyright directive which requires laws more or less like the DMCA. But it does have some flexibility. I think it's possible to implement the directive in such a way that a free program that only does the authorized lawful activities is itself lawful. The question is, can any governments be convinced to do so? And so far they don't seem to be listening. It may take public protests to get them to adopt laws that are not cruel and draconian. The other law in the US that prohibits many kinds of free software is patent law. In the US, software ideas can be patented. And that makes it hard to write programs, because when you write a program, you're combining lots of different ideas. It can be very many different ideas in one program. If you look at a word processor, you are likely to find hundreds of features. Well, each feature is at least one idea and could be patented in at least one way, sometimes several different ways by different people. So developing a word processor and putting in the modern features becomes like crossing a minefield. At each design decision, probably nothing will happen. But there's a certain chance you will step on a patent which will blow up your project. Europe, the European Union, I should say, is right now considering whether to allow software patents. And the decision has been done in a rather devious and dishonest fashion. The European Commission released a directive for patenting computer-implemented inventions. The text of it was actually written by someone who works for the Business Software Alliance. They didn't admit this. It was discovered because they published it in Word format. Let that be a lesson to you. Never send people files in Word format. Besides, you don't want to risk sending viruses to people, do you? Anyway, and if somebody sends you a file in Word format, write back saying, I can't read Word files, please send this in some public documented format. And there are many reasons why this is very important for our future. Anyway, they say that this directive will not permit software patents. It will only permit things like patenting physical processes where there's a computer involved in carrying them out. But the language that they say will have this effect is rather vague. They just say that the invention has to have a technical quality. Well, that could mean anything. And we know that the European Patent Office wants to stretch the meaning. It operates under a treaty that says that software is not patentable, and it has been disregarding that treaty systematically, issuing software patents, but their validity is questionable because the treaty says they shouldn't be. So we are asking Parliament to replace that vague wording with clear wording that clearly does the exact same thing it's supposed to do already. What possible reason could there be for saying no to that? What possible, honest, legitimate reason could there be for saying no to that? It's clear that what we're seeing is an example of the fact that the European Union, as currently structured, is not democratic enough. It only responds to a small degree to the public and listens a lot to businesses. But we have a chance of winning. The battle's not over yet. And it looks like things have been going to some extent in our direction. Whether we'll win the vote that is coming in about a week, I don't know. But even if we lose that, it's not the end of the process. And we'll keep on fighting. And you can help in this fight. At this point, the future of free software is not just a matter of writing lots of software. It has become political in the nature of the work, just as it has always been a political issue in what we're trying to achieve. We have to organize to defend our freedom. And we face a threat that is even subtler, because it doesn't come from a proposal to impose new laws. It's a proposal, a plan to change all computers, to design them to take away our freedom. The proponents called it trusted computing. This name is deceptive, because what they really mean is that software companies will be able to trust your computer to disobey you and obey them instead. So we call it treacherous computing, which from the computer owner's point of view describes it more properly. The idea is to put facilities into the computer so that data can be stored in encrypted formats so that there's no way for any unauthorized program to get at them. And this will be used, of course, for published data to implement DRM. But it's not limited to published data. They can apply it to your data, too. An application can write your data in an encrypted format so that no unauthorized program can read your data, which means that you are locked in forever. Just imagine if Microsoft changes a future version of Word to use treacherous computing to write the new version of Word files, because they change the format, you know, with just about every version of Word. Well, in a few years, they could change it to use treacherous computing. And then it will be not just painful to write free software to access Word files, it would be illegal or impossible. So this is a threat that we're going to have to fight against. We may have to organize to get laws passed. I don't believe that encryption and signature devices should be prohibited. They're very useful. But it would make sense to have a law requiring that these devices must be fully under the control of the purchaser, and all keys associated with the machine must be delivered to the purchaser so the purchaser can reinstall them and use them elsewhere. I think that would put the kibosh on treacherous computing. But they could still provide fast encryption and signature hardware, which we can use in lots of other very useful ways. So, there are many threats today, and I hope that you will join us in fighting against them. I have heard that the management here is trying to replace free software with user subjugating software. I've heard that they are switching over to Microsoft email software. I guess they must want more virus trouble. But it's not enough just to laugh at the stupid decision. you need to reject it. Establish your own email servers and tell people to send you mail there. Tell people not to use CERN's Microsoft email server. Put your foot down and resist. Say that you want CERN to be free. Now, I'm about to end my speech. I'd like to mention that we have a bunch of contact cards. If you would like the FSF to put you on a mailing list and get back to you later, you can write your name on the contact cards. Where are they?
That side.
Oh, here they. Oh, they're supposed to be cut in half.
Yeah, but you didn't tell me that.
I did. I told you when you came in.
Yeah, I know. You didn't tell me when you sent me the mail.
Okay,
So
I'm sorry.
if you
Is
want
there someone
one,
who
just
can
tear
cut
one
them
in half, okay?
Well, there may. I hope they're enough. If they're not enough, you'll just have to print more. In fact, 2 of you can use one of them. And on the back, if you want to make a donation with a credit card, you can do that too. I also have with me a few things that I'm selling on behalf of the FSF. The FSF will get the money, not me. I have 3 copies of my book of essays, Free Software, Free Society. And I've got a bunch of metal pins and some key rings. And these I'm charging, I guess, 10 euro. And for this, 25 euro, or the equivalent in Swiss currency. And I have a bunch of stickers. These are giveaways. Uh-oh. I don't have the big roll of stickers. I only have the small one. I meant to bring the other roll, and I must have left it home. I'm sorry. Anyway, we've got some stickers, so take the stickers you want. And I will now close by introducing my alter ego. People sometimes criticize my holier-than-thou attitude. Well, you know, I am holy. I'm a saint, so it's my job to be holy. I am Saint Ignatius of the Church of Emacs. I bless your computer, my child. Emacs started out as a text editor, which became a way of life for many users and ultimately a religion. We even have a great schism between 2 rival versions of Emacs. And now we also have saints. Fortunately, no gods. To be a member of the Church of Emacs, you must recite the Confession of the Faith. You must say, there is no system but GNU, and Linux is one of its kernels. The Church of Emacs has certain advantages compared with some other churches I won't name. For instance, to be a saint in the Church of Emacs does not require celibacy. So if you're looking at for a church to be holy in, you might consider ours. But it does require living a life of moral purity. You must make the vow to exorcise the evil proprietary operating systems from all the computers under your direct practical control. Then install a wholly free operating system, and then only install free applications on top of that. If you can make this vow and live by it, then you too will be a saint, and you too may have a halo, if you can find one, because they don't make them anymore. Sometimes people ask me, in the Church of Emacs, is it a sin to use VI? The answer is, using a free version of VI is not a sin, it's a penance. And sometimes people ask if my Halo is really an old computer disk. This is no computer disk, this is my Halo. But it was a computer disk in a previous existence. Thank you.
Okay, to reiterate, if you'd like to make a donation, there's a whole variety of credit cards they take. You can even fill in twice on one form or just tear it in half.
You can also accept donations in cash. Yeah. But I guess I should do the questions first.
Yeah. Okay, this has been a very long colloquium. This has been a rather special one. I think this is the biggest turnout I've ever seen. And also I'd like to point out that Richard, I think, is the first speaker ever to turn up at CERN on the bus. So let's try and keep the questions to, I don't know, 15 minutes or something like that. So first one. Anyone?
Do you think are there any flaws in the GPL?
Are there any flaws in the GPL? I don't know of any major flaws. We're planning on clarifying some parts and tweaking some parts for GPL version 3 and putting in, some substantial changes to deal more with patents and more with and to deal with the issue of software for use in network servers. But I don't think that there's a flaw.
I'm confused with the actually I have read some of it and
I can't hear you. I can't understand what you're saying at all. I'm sorry.
what I'm going to say is that I'm a bit confused with the license in the way that your license allows distribution companies to distribute the product.
Yes.
A number of programmers all over the world have contributed to that software.
Yes.
I think there's a tendency in the GPL that allows one company to become so popular after some time called Red Hat.
But Red Hat does not have a monopoly and is not the only place that's redistributing software.
But when a large number of people, as you mentioned, that when popularity increases, a large number of people uses that, then the wealth they are making from that, shouldn't it be given to those software?
Oh, we don't agree. I'm sorry. That's absolutely not our philosophy. So the GPL is not intended to do that. So, of course, you don't have to like it, but I don't consider that a flaw.
No, but I mean, people who have worked for that software, that means that kind of...
Right? We do not say that you must pay them. If you had to pay them, then it would not be free software. So...
That's right.
So the license doesn't say that you have to pay them.
Distributor distributes something, it's
No.
Perhaps this could be followed up offline, because I think there's some other questions as well.
Basically, I'm not finished. I don't want to argue. There's no point arguing this, but I want it to be clear that what you are advocating is contrary to the idea of free software. Now, of course, you're free to have contrary views, but there's no way in the world that we would change the GPL to require a thing like that.
Hello, I had a question about a similarity I noticed in the accuracy of language. in the aims and goals between what you're advocating, what the future role of science in information society is advocating, and what lawyers like Lawrence Lessig and his Creative Commons.
Yes, there is a lot of
advocating.
similarity. In
And
fact,
could there be a way of
he
getting...
wrote the introduction to the preface to the book.
Oh, I see.
So it's not, we do know each other, and
Yeah, but I was wondering, I mean, voices were running around at PrepCom 3 yesterday that Microsoft is threatening to boycott World Summit on Information Society, which might not be such a bad thing.
it would be great.
Yeah.
When Russia
But
boycotted the UN, they got the Korean War.
Nevertheless, it's also possible that the organizers, being whom we know, might kowtow and decide to take out of all the text the things on open source. Could it be possible to
Well,
have an
I'm
alliance?
not advocating open source. I'm not particularly delighted to
No.
see people talking about open source because that's the weaker movement.
Sure, but they don't even want that, so let alone free software.
Right. Well, I don't expect much good to come out of the World Summit on the Information Society. I think it may well be that the best thing that could happen is that it would break down. Nowadays, almost any international agreement, to have any chance of getting the US to agree to it, it has to be bad. So it's better if they break down.
Thank you very much.
There's a question here somewhere? No?
I'm almost afraid to ask this, but sometimes...
Could you please speak louder and clearer? I can't hear a word you say.
I'm almost afraid of asking this because sometimes talking with my friends I get into huge confusions, but is the GPL, for instance, I see it as quite fair adding a small clause taking away freedom zero, that is using it for any use. In my case, for instance, I could say, I don't want this to use by any military means.
I disagree with that.
Why is that?
If we, you could do a thing like that, but I would say it's not free software because people are restricted in what they can do with it. Now that would be I wouldn't agree with that restriction myself. I mean, aside from that, I think that any such use restriction is unacceptable. I wouldn't support that one.